yesterday, we all thought that Netanyahu had 55 recommendations and that Gantz had 57. It's no longer the case. Now the Arab list clarified to the president that 3 of its members from the Balad party are not joining this recommendation, and therefore Benny Gantz has 54 recommendations versus 55 for Netanyahu, but then Blue and White has 33 seats versus 31 for Likud. So technically, based on those figures, the president can ask any of those candidates to try and form a government, form a coalition, except that we know that neither of them has a majority, and therefore the only possibility at this point is really to have a national unity government between Likud and Blue and White. But then the question will be, will Likud be willing to give up on this agreement with its partners and just negotiate directly with Blue and White without its partners? And will Blue and White kind of soften its opposition to have anything to do with Netanyahu until at least he's convicted, if he's convicted? And of course the question will be in a rotation government who will be first, Netanyahu or Gantz. So all these questions have to be clarified before the president can try and force the 2 leaders to form a coalition together.
Certainly all happening. And tell me, do you think that RIvlin will exclude these Balad votes? What choice does he really have?
Well, I think since he received this letter from the head of the unified list, the list of the Arab parties, he doesn't really have a choice. I mean, there's no room for interpretation. Until this letter arrived to him, he could have said, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I got a recommendation from a list. I don't really care what happens inside the list, but now it's very clear that there only are 10 recommendations, 10 MKs from the joint list recommending Gantz. So it's very clear. So there's no room for him there's no room for interpretation, I would say, and therefore the decision now is his. Whether he wants to give the first chance to Netanyahu or to Gantz, or whether he wants to try and knock their heads together and really convince them to try and work it out to form a national unity government.